you think fits with the reading. So that way you guys kind of have a better working understanding of how the frameworks are meant to be used. And then, so it's going to be 5 essay questions that I'll provide. You're only responsible for answering 3 of the 5, but you want to make sure that you're using a theoretical framework to work through your answer. And I could give you guys some examples of what that would look like. I'll even provide you guys an example of an essay question from a midterm, because the way that I do my questions is like 3 questions in one. So you want to make sure that you're reading the questions carefully, you're answering every component of the question. But I'll provide you guys an example so you have a better understanding of what I'm talking about. So the first theory that we're dealing with is, it comes out of the Cal State LA's Pan-African Studies Department. Actually, the author of this theory is the chair of the department. The theory is called African American Male Theory, or for short, AAMT. The framework that you could work through, it states that African American people are resistant and resilient, with an innate capacity for self-determination and with a limited capacity for morality and intelligence. So just to make it brief, right? African people are born with innate capacity for brilliance, and they're resistant and resilient. So that's the theoretical framework. The theory is African American Male Theory. The framework is African people are born with an innate capacity for brilliance, and they're resistant and resilient. So that's the theory. And again, I'll provide these to you guys once the class is out. So our second theory is critical race theory. That's the theory that we're working through. The framework that we're using is counter storytelling. So opposed to focusing on the narratives of dominant culture, the focus is placed on telling narratives from the perspective of those who are marginalized by dominant culture. So for example, if we look at the discovery of America, if we look at that story through the lens of Christopher Columbus, right, that's the dominant narrative. But what counter storytelling will do is look at that happenings from the lens of the people who were on this country prior to Columbus's arrival. So we're going to look at it from the standpoint of the natives, right? If we're going to look at the death of Breonna Taylor, we're not going to focus from the standpoint of the officers who did the shooting, but we're going to tell that story from Breonna Taylor's vantage point or from the vantage point of her boyfriend, right? So that's the emphasis of counter storytelling. And really, if you think about this class is moving through a counter storytelling method, right? Everything that we do, think about the readings that we have, are really situated in this idea of counter storytelling. And then your final theoretical framework is the idea of funds of knowledge. And funds of knowledge is knowledge that gets passed down from generation to generation that typically gets unrecognized by dominant society. And that passing down stems from either a family structure or a community structure, right? And funds of knowledge could look like, you know, your grandmother's tortilla recipe that she passes down from grandmother to mother to you, right? The gumbo recipe that your grandmother may pass down, right? Those are ways to think about this idea of funds of knowledge. So you want to think about ways that you could answer your questions through these frameworks, right? It's perfectly fine if you use counter storytelling for all 3 answers. That's okay. It's okay if you use funds of knowledge for all 3 answers. It's okay if you use African American male theory for all 3 answers. To give you guys a little key, right? There is no wrong answer for a theoretical framework. It's really going to be about how you articulate while you're using this framework, right? So it's really about your ability to articulate the reasoning behind that framework is going to make it a right or wrong answer. The only way you can really mess this up is by not using a theoretical framework. Does that make sense? And then hopefully what we'll do in the readings is, you know, we'll try to place each reading within a framework, and hopefully that'll kind of give you guys a better understanding of how these will work. And then what I'll also do is when I give you an example of a question, I'll answer that question using a theoretical framework, so that way you can see it in actual practice, okay? All right, so our first, before I move on, any other questions as it pertains to the frameworks? So our first reading was Eurocentrism to Polycentrism, and it was the chapter on the myth of the West. So for what I did, as you guys, whoever had a chance to look at the study guides, I kind of framed everything in form of a question. If you guys want to take the time to answer the question, that's cool too. It's going to make the process for you guys, you know, a little bit easier because you already have the answers. But if not, that's fine as well. But just to kind of get you guys some things, to kind of place you in the way to start thinking about the readings, right? So how is the juxtaposition between the East and the West articulated through the chapter? How does this understanding lead to the flattening of non-Western cultures and the proliferation of Eurocentrism? So that's just one way to kind of think about what you read and through framing it through a question, right? How does colonialism work to make the colonized undervalue their name, language, spiritual practices, and culture? And again, that's also from the reading. What is the article's critique of Mimi's articulation of racism? What does the article feel Mimi leaves out in his assessment of racism? How does the reading problematize the Black and white binary? Okay. And then what is the importance of post-colonial studies and concepts like Said's Orientalism and Spivak's subaltern? How can these concepts shape representation of marginalized people? Anybody want to talk about or try to answer those, or are you okay with moving to the next reading? Because again, if you do answer them, it's just going to kind of make your project easier over the weekend, but it's up to you. All right. So we'll move on then to Césaire and the discourse on colonialism. Again, everything is phrased through a question. How does Césaire utilize Hitler in his argumentation against colonialism? Is this approach effective or ineffective? So that's one question or one way to think about the reading. According to Césaire, what does colonialism do to the colonizer? How does this relate to the boomerang effects of colonization? And okay, how does Césaire articulate colonialism leading to thingification? So how does Césaire articulate colonialism leading to thingification? What is the thesis of discourse? That's the title of the book. And what is the methodological approach utilized by Césaire? Do you deem his methods effective? So really that last question, if you think about your journal entries, that should answer that question for you, right? Any questions, comments, or concerns on Césaire before we move on to Fanon? All right. So Fanon's A Dying Colonialism, the chapter that we read was The Voice. This is The Voice of Algeria. First question or first framing of the question, what are the forces that shifted Algerian attitudes towards the radio? Why were the Algerian families reluctant to allow the radio in their home? And what led to the change that allowed them to embrace the radio? So being attentive to the shifts in the way that the Algerian people viewed the purpose of the radio, right? What would you estimate as the focus of this chapter, the radio or the Algerian family? Support your claim with examples from the text, right? So what is Fanon's real focus? Is it the radio itself, or is the focus the family? And then whatever you choose, you should support that choice with examples from the reading. What ways were Algerians able to undermine the French attempts to prevent the radio transmissions of Radio Algiers? So there was things that took place once Radio Algiers began to get really popular that the French would do to stop that transmission from taking place. But there were ways that the Algerians would undermine those stoppages. What were the ways that the Algerians took to undermine that? And then finally, how does the film Battle of Algiers support or counter the claims made in the readings? This is The Voice of Algiers. So what things did you see in the film that supports the arguments that Fanon makes in A Dying Colonialism, the chapter of Voice of Algiers, right? Or what things did you see in the film that counter what Fanon claims in the reading, right? So that's what this question is getting you to think about. Any questions about either A Dying Colonialism or the Battle of Algiers? Okay. So we'll move to Glissant, Poetics of Relations. This quote is extracted from the reading. Live in seclusion or open up to the other. What is the significance of this claim? How does this claim problematize the notion of globalization? What is relationship subversion? What are examples of relationship subversion? And how does this concept speak to the agency of the colonized? Why does poetry become a method of tremendous importance for Glissant? How does this notion affirm the idea of relationships of subversion? So those two thoughts are kind of tied together. How does this chapter problematize the biblical understanding of the Tower of Babel right? So remember the chapter that we read was called The Tower. And then finally, why is creolization so important for Guizot as it pertains to the idea of relations? What are some alternate what are some alternate examples of creolization? So what are some other creolizations that you could think of? One of them that I mentioned was gumbo, right? So what other ways could you think about creolization being personified? And then for our last reading, we had the book again, Eurocentrism to Polycentrism, and it was the chapter Realism and Representation. So in the article, it states, instead of capturing the real, cameras and literature actually capture something else. So what is it that the camera and literature actually captures? And that's in the very first start of the reading. I think it's in the opening paragraph. How does the intersection of stereotypes and power lead to a double consciousness for marginalized viewers? Pulled directly from the reading. How does the one-drop rule shape representation on film? So think about that. How does the work of Ngugi lead to the cultural renaissance in African filmmaking? So Ngugi, although we did not read him, he does make an appearance in this chapter on realism and representation. So look that up, because they talk very specifically on how his work informed the work of African movie producers, and what is that connection, right? And then how do the role of the 7 stereotypes, again, the reading gave us 5, but I added 2 more stereotypes onto that. So how do those stereotypes shape and design, how do these stereotypes that are designed to encapsulate Blackness inform Baldwin's pillars of white inferiority? So we talked about the pillars of white inferiority. How does those pillars situate and fit to these 7 stereotypes? What is the intersection? Is there any questions about any of that we covered so far? And again, these won't be the questions on the test, but these are just questions to kind of get you to look at certain parts of the readings. And if you answer these questions in the study guide, you'll be more than prepared for your midterm. So from a content standpoint, if you're able to answer these questions, you'll be good on content. Just to keep it 100 with y'all, right? Like the only time I see anybody like not do well on the test is by either not using a theoretical framework or not answering all of the questions in their entirety. So let me do this. If there's no other questions, I'm going to share my screen and I'll show you guys an example of a midterm question, and then I'll answer the question using a theoretical framework so you can see how that all kind of plays out. And then once we're done with that, we'll go over the readings and how many journal entries we should have. Give me 1 second, let me get that pulled up. So can everybody see that? All right, so we'll deal with question 1. So the question, how old are African people? There are 3 acceptable answers. You must also name an African individual prior to European contact and the significant contributions of this individual. In this essay, you should include why this information is important in the world of academia or in your personal experience or development, right? So that's 1 question, but you can see through that 1 question, there's like 3 questions embedded in there. So how old are African people? That's 1 question that should be addressed. I give them a hint to let them know there's 3 acceptable answers, right? You must also name an African individual prior to European contact. So that's another question. So that's 2. And their significant contributions, right? So that's like 3 questions there. In this essay, you should include why this information is important. 4, in the world of academia or in your personal experiences or development. So as you can see, there's 4 questions embedded into that 1 question. So if you don't answer how old are African people, but you answer the other 3 questions, then you're going to lose a point, right? If you answer all 4 components of that question, but you don't use a theoretical framework, you're going to lose a point, right? So let me answer the question, and I'll use a theoretical framework to kind of give you an idea. So working through a theoretical framework of African-American male theory, which states that African people are resistant and resilient, also working through the theoretical framework of counter storytelling, I know that African people can be traced back 8 million years old. And significant individual prior to European contact is Imhotep, as he was the first multi-genius in the world and the actual father of medicine, developing 12 medical patents prior to the birth of Hippocrates, excuse me. This information becomes important through a counter storytelling framework because this information often gets effaced in dominant educational environments, and it speaks to the agency and the resilience of African people using a African-American male theory framework. So in this example, I use two frameworks. You don't have to use two frameworks. One is sufficient, but you can see how I'm weaving my answers through these frameworks, right? And I'm also addressing every component of the question. So does everybody kind of get an idea of what I mean by when I say answering every component of the question and when I say by using the theoretical framework? Okay, cool. So let's do this. We'll do a little activity and then I'll go over our fishbowl and I'll go over our journals. So for our first reading, Eurocentrism to Polycentrism, Myths of the West, given the questions that I kind of laid out, where would you situate this reading in a theoretical framework? Would you say it's African-American male theory, critical race theory, or funds of knowledge? And again, it really is no wrong answer. It's more so how you articulate why that answer is chosen. So if we're thinking about some of the material in that chapter, right? The flattening of non-Western culture, right? The idea of the East versus the West. We have, Exo said critical race theory. So why would you say critical race theory?
Just because it kind of directly fills in a lot of gaps that conventional history books don't really cover. Like it's talking about a lot of information that's not emphasized. A lot of, Western history books don't bother to really illuminate those areas of human history. And that's why I think it's pretty clear counter storytelling. Just very clear and very direct in examining those areas.
Yep, absolutely, I agree. So let's move to the.
And my name's Ethan, by the way. Ethan, I know it still looks weird on the.
Yeah, I'm sorry, bro. Like that shit don't say Ethan, so I just kind of read what it said. So I'll make a mental note to say Ethan.
First letter of my name, then my last name. But yeah, it's Ethan.
Okay, got you, man. So yes, Ethan is absolutely correct. It's counter storytelling. So if we were to move on to Césaire's discourse on colonialism, just a couple of the themes in the reading, right? It's an anti-colonial reading. He's this very large critique of colonialism. He speaks on the effects of colonialism for the colonizer, not just the colonized, right? He's dealing with this notion and these ideas of thingification. So which framework do you think closely fits to this reading? And they can be used more than once. So Drew says critical race theory. Why do you say critical race theory, Drew?
I say critical race theory because like it has to do with the institutionalization of racism. And so colonialism was like the first step. I mean, it's not the first step in history, but it's definitely like the beginning of how it affects, the race relations nowadays. So it sets up for what we now recognize as critical race theory.
Yep. And then keep in mind, I do want to be very specific, right? Critical race theory is the theory. There's a gang of frameworks that go under critical race theory. So the framework that we're dealing with under the theory of critical race theory is counter storytelling, right? So he's right. Counter storytelling is it does situate this reading. Is there another one that someone could think of that would fit this reading?
I would say the African male theory, based on the fact that being resistant and resilient towards oppression and colonization and overcoming everything that's happened since slavery and before that.
Yeah. And it also plays out, and if you reading the text, right, you see Césaire's agency, you see Césaire's brilliance, right? And he's arguing and advocating for the innate capacity of African people to be brilliant and how the colonial institution is interrupting that process. So Brett, you're dead on. Okay, let's move to Fanon. This is the voice of Algiers. What framework do you think fits that? So a couple of the themes, right? The radio is a prevalent theme, so media. The family takes center stage in this as well. Also an anti-colonial text. So what do you think would situate this reading? Which framework? And again, there's no wrong answer. It's more so in your articulation of your answer. We have the family, we have the radio, we have anti-colonial struggle, we have revolution, we have media, we have gender dynamics in the readings, right? How the telling of revolutionary activity is being manifested through the voice of Algiers, right? So what framework do you think closely fits this reading?
I would say critical race theory, just for the fact that the Algerians were able to use the radio against the French.
Yeah. So counter storytelling, right? So not saying how the radio impacted the French, but focusing on how the radio impacted the Algerians. Absolutely.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
Is there another one you guys can think of? So for
ideas of funds and knowledge also.
Funds and knowledge. Yep, that's the one I was.
Because word of mouth during the revolution in Algiers.
And that's how generational information was passed down, right, through the voice of Algiers. That's how the Algerian community knew what the happenings were in the revolution through the voice of Algiers, right? So again, remember, funds of knowledge is knowledge that gets passed down from generation to generation that does not get recognized in dominant society. So funds of knowledge would be also a theoretical framework that you could use. Poetics of relation, right? So we have the idea of the role of language and its ability to bring people together or keep them apart is a theme, right? This idea of relationship subversion, so using the language against the dominant culture and doing new things with the language that it was not intended for. The focus on poetry as a method of producing literature, right? And then this idea of problematizing the conventional story of the Tower of Babel, right? So these are some of the themes that we have running through Poetics of Relation. And then most importantly, this idea of relation itself. So what framework you think best fits this reading?
I think the African American male theory could also work for this, because it talks about, you know, the subversion of, you know, how they used language to subvert colonialism, how they're resilient. I'm also wondering if maybe funds of knowledge might also be relevant, because it talks about, like, you know, how these languages that they use to subvert the colonial language, you know, was passed down from, you know, word of mouth, passed down from parent to child, and so on and so forth. So I'm wondering if maybe those two wouldn't be relevant.
Absolutely, spot on. And I would even say counter storytelling too. So like this reading, you can see all three frameworks in play, right? Because if you're talking about the use of language, he's not focusing on French, right? He's focused on Creole, which is not a dominant language. So that is also a counter storytelling focus. So this is one reading that you could use all three, really. And again, I can't overemphasize enough. You could really use all three, and all of the answers is just more on how you articulate your reasoning behind you using that answer, okay? And finally, the Eurocentrism to polycentrism. This one is the focus on realism and representation. So we have the idea of the real, takes center stage in this reading. Stereotypes and power, that takes center stage, right? One drop rule, so the notion of identity, the importance of language as it pertains to filmmaking, and this, again, this reoccurring theme of stereotypes. So what framework will we place this reading?
I think it's two. I think it's African male theory and the critical race theory, because it not only focuses on kind of like the effects of these stereotypes and offering like the other side of the story. So like, for instance, when they were saying the Mississippi burning example, they said that like the movie focused on like the oppressors as the heroes, so and they took like the attention away from like the movement going on. And so I think it could be both in that sense, because it focuses on how these stereotypes affect certain people.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, that's just to kind of get your guys' mind working through these frameworks, right? But again, they all work. And again, you could use, if you want to use counter storytelling for all your answers, that's cool, right? But just do not forget to use them, right? Because that's the only way that you can really lose points, is not by not using those frameworks. So what I'm going to do is read through who I have who's fishbowled already. If your name does not come up and you have fishbowled, send me a message and I'll put you down. If you do not hear your name, no big deal. Just know that on the second half of this semester, you want to kind of be more active about making sure that you fishbowl, okay? Again, in no particular order, I'm going to just read off who I have. Brandon, Drew, Glenda, Lewis, Thelonious, Carla, Joshua, Lewis, Jade, Fionn, Jamar, Pablo, Golden, Kenny, Jaime, Matthew, Tori, Lilia, Leonardo, and Sebastian. So those are the people who I have for the fishbowl. If you need me to read them again, I can. But if you did not hear your name, and it should be on there, let me know. I think I'm missing somebody there.
Professor, I know there's two Luises.
Yeah.
I haven't fishbowled. I don't think so.
But,
No,
you haven't. Luis Hero went twice. He went twice.
Oh, okay. I understand.
So just know that on the second half of the semester, make sure that you fishbowl. And then Tyler, didn't you fishbowl already too?
Nah, I ain't. But I'm like basically just kind of hopped in here and there. But nah, if that's nothing. I'll for sure do it next semester. If I got to do it twice, I can do that too.
Yeah, and again, it's not like, if you haven't done it yet, you're not losing points, right? This has to be done before the semester ends. So I just want to check in, let you guys know who I have on file already, and that way, if I don't have you on file, just keep in the back of your head. I need to be more apt to participate in the fishbowl. Okay. Is there any other questions, comments, or concerns for the midterm or anything in the semester? Yes, you still have a chance to fishbowl. How is it going to work this next half? I don't see. So what we'll do, instead of the readings, you have videos. And so what you'll be fishbowling on are the videos that we watched, right? So that's how that would take place going forward.
So when we're writing about like the theory, I'm confused as how we would like apply it. I guess I don't know how I would word like applying the theory.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So again, I'll use the test question that I used as an example earlier. So the question asks, how old are African people? What are some of the significant contributions of African people prior to European contact? And then why is this information important, right? So the way that you can answer that using the framework is through a critical race theory counter storytelling framework. African people date back 8 million years old, right? Through this framework, it becomes important to tell this story because in dominant educational spaces, that information never gets told. So that's the way that you can kind of work through the theory to tell your answer. Theories come from the readings or from the lectures. The theories come from the lectures. And again, I'm going to provide you guys with an outline of the theories. I just emailed out the wrong copy. So you'll have a list of all those theories. And I'll also place it on the Google Classroom site. It's a take-home midterm too, right? So if you give yourself enough time to do it, you should literally be able to have the readings out, look through the readings, use the framework, and answer the questions that way. I mean, you have about 5 days to do the midterm. It's only 3 of the 5 questions. So I would assume as long as you don't wait to the last minute, you should be able to use all your material to answer the question. The journals will be due with the midterm. So when you submit your midterm, submit your journals also, and then I'll collect them again for the second half of the semester with the final day of class.
For the essay questions, did you want as long as we answer the questions, there's no like links?
Yep.
Right.
So I've seen in the past, like, no bullshit. I had a student answer the question in 3 sentences, and they used a theoretical framework, and they got full points. Like each sentence was addressing one part of the question. They worked it through a theoretical framework, and they got full points. I had students who answered 3 paragraphs, right? And they didn't use a theoretical framework, or they forgot one component of this question and they lost points. So I'm not concerned with the length. I'm more concerned with you answering the question correctly. I mean, to be honest with y'all, right, the shorter that it is easier for me. You know what I mean? I'm not saying to write that shit short, but just from a grading standpoint, I'm not going to be mad at it being short.
Okay. Just sorry. Does the journals include the Battle of Algiers?
No, I didn't make you guys journal for that. So
Okay.
don't worry about that. What I'm going to do after the questions, I'm going to go through the readings, and I'm going to let you guys know how many journals we should have for at this point in the semester. In the chat, so what we'll be covering in the class next week, okay, good question. So next week, we won't cover any material. I'm not going to make you guys read some shit and then do a midterm. So what we'll do is break you guys into groups for your final project. So it'll be a very short class. I'll have a list of current events available, and then you guys just choose which current events you want to do, and then that's going to comprise your group. And then from there, you guys should exchange information, and then you'll start meeting, on your own to start developing your project. And that we'll do next week. And then once that's done, we'll let out, and then we'll pick back up, the following week.
Professor.
Yeah.
Will you post up on the Google Classroom the journals that we're gonna need to turn in? Like,
yeah, I'm gonna go over that right now. When I get done with all the questions, I'm gonna share my screen, and I'll open up the Google Classroom site, and we'll go over how many journals you guys should have to turn in for the midterm.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, so let's go over these journals real quick, and then if there's no other questions, we'll call it a day. Bear with me. All right. Okay, so unthinking Eurocentrism. So this is our first reading. So that's 1 entry, right? Then we did Césaire, that's 2 entries. Dying Colonialism is 3 entries. Poetics is 4. And that should be it. Did we do the other? No, hold on. Yeah, so you guys should be at 4 so far. We didn't have an entry for the Voice of Algiers. Actually, excuse me, 5, because we did the other one twice. So one more time. So 1, this is the most recent reading, Stereotype and Realism. This is our first reading, so that's 2, 3, 4, 5. So there should be 5 journal entries. Does that make sense? Does that sound about right for what you guys have as far as your entries?
Yes.
Okay.
There's 2 that says Césaire. You only want 1 for Césaire.
Yeah, it should only be 1. So I think what happens is it's 2. I had to split the reading up because my scanner only takes so much. So that's 1 complete reading. So that should only be 1 entry. So we should be at 5. So you'll turn in those 5 journals along with your midterm. Or if you want to submit it to the Google Classroom site, there'll be a separate place that you can submit those journals. There'll also be a separate place for you to submit your midterm as well. Or you could just email them to me. When you email them to me, please submit it in this fashion. I'm gonna put in the chat. So it should look like that, right? The class title, you put the number TVF 424001, midterm, and then your last name. For the stereotypes, it should only be 1 entry. Could you label those as well as for the journals to help with organization? Hey Josh, do me a favor, man. Explain your question a little bit more. Label what? What you mean?
Yeah, no, like, so like, I guess what it means, like, I'm thinking Eurocentrism as journal 1, and then journal 2, what the readings are, and then journal 3, what the readings are supposed to be.
Okay, what I'll do is I'll post an entry on Google Classroom saying journal 1, Eurocentralism, chapter 1.
Yeah.
And I'll just I'll post that up there as well.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah, no worries. For those who have 2 entries on Unthinking Eurocentrism, you should. So the first reading for our semester was Unthinking Eurocentrism. That was chapter 1, right? And then last week we read Unthinking Eurocentrism, chapter 5. So there should be 2 entries for Unthinking Eurocentrism. 2 for for the first week, I had to separate it because the scan wouldn't allow me to get all of them in once. Does that answer your question, Golden? So, okay, cool. Yeah. So it looks like it's 2 readings for week 1 of Unthinking Eurocentrism, but it's not. Those should be combined, but the way that my computer works, I had to split those into 2. So you should have 2 entries for your Unthinking Eurocentrism, chapter 1, which is divided into 2 PDFs on Google Classroom, and then chapter 5, which is 1 PDF. But I'll go back and I'll put on there journal entry 1, Unthinking Eurocentrism, chapter 1, journal entry 2, discourse on colonialism, journal entry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that way it will be laid out for you guys pretty clearly. Any other questions? No. Let me do, check the chat. Okay, let me check one more thing. I just kind of want to put your presentations in the back of your mind. I don't want to put too much emphasis on it, but just kind of get you thinking about it. Are you supposed to answer the questions 1 time, 2 times? Isaac, can you restate your question for me?
So like the stereotypes one is separated into 2 different no wait, not the other one. It's the one that's separated into 2 halves because there's not enough space, I think.
Yes, okay.
Are we supposed to answer the questions 1 time just because they're separated, or is it 2 times for each separation?
Think of it as 1 whole reading.
Oh, okay.
Think of it as 1 whole reading. That's just a technical issue on my end because I can't scan 20 pages at once. So just think of it as 1 complete chapter.
Oh, okay, so it's just 5 entries then?
Yes, it's just 5 entries. Yep.
Oh, okay.
But
I thought it was like 9.
No. But again, like I said, I'll post on there which entry for which reading, and that way, if you guys still have questions, then let me know. 1 second, you guys. Pull up our. So scratch that. I don't even have it on the syllabus. So yeah, don't worry about it. I'll have all that prepared the week that we meet after the midterms. We'll go over those current events and everything. So just focus on your midterms this week. Give yourself time, man. Take home. You have plenty of days to do it. Don't do it at the last minute. That way you can use all your resources that you have available. I believe the majority of the class, Yep, that's one way to look at it, essay per day. The majority of the class lectures that have been recorded are posted on your Google Classroom site, so that way you can review those to help you study and prepare. But I'm very confident in your guys' ability to do well on the test. The only thing that will trip you guys up is not using a theoretical framework or not answering the question completely. Other than that, you guys will be completely fine. Just from our class conversation, I know you guys are prepared for the midterm. It won't be too big of a deal. Any other questions, comments, or concerns?
We're answering 3 of the 5, right?
3 of the 5. Yep. And I'll put together a prompt. They'll have like expectations and all that will come along with the midterm. And I'll also post that to the Google Classroom site. And then if any other questions come up between now and answering the midterm, holler at me. If you have questions about understanding the question, let me know. I'll help clarify those as well. Use me as a resource. I won't give you the answer, of course, but I'll point you in the right direction. All right, any other questions?
Can you just like quickly explain again what the funds of knowledge was?
Yeah. So funds of knowledge is knowledge or information that's passed down from generation to generation that is typically unrecognized in dominant society. And, and this knowledge is produced from like family units or community structures.
Got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else? All right. I'm going to stop the recording.